go ahead and begin tonight, and in just a few minutes, I'm going to ask Robbie if he'd lead us in an opening prayer. For those of you that were not here Sunday, you missed a phenomenal class, which I believe is already up online. I encourage you to check that out, listen to it. John Moore did an amazing job talking about some of these ancient cities that we see. I will never pronounce it right. Göbekli Tepe. Göbekli Tepe. Thank you. Göbekli Tepe. A city that is estimated to be somewhere around 15,000 years old. Obviously, it doesn't line up with a biblical narrative that we see, but he gave us some really good things to help us kind of wrap our minds around the times at which some of these cities would have been established. You know, Egypt is a very ancient city, established by some of Noah's grandchildren. Babylon, where we always get the Tower of Babel, another ancient city. We look at these and the ages that are given to them, we recognize must be somewhere this side of the flood. Certainly this side of creation, but this side of the flood especially. We talked a little bit about the pyramids and how the pyramids not only contain marine fossils in the limestone, telling us that they were cut from rocks that are going to be post-flood, evidence of that. But also they contain a technology that we just don't have today. We've lost the technology to build structures like the pyramids. What happened to that technology? Where did we get it from? You know, the Bible tells us pre-flood we were crafting with iron. We were forging iron. So we had a technology that was there that was at some period after the flood lost. John did a fantastic job. I won't try to recount the whole class, but I encourage you to go and give it a listen. It was just really, really good. So we have been talking about evidences of the flood. We've wrapped that up, and we're really drawing to an end to the class. We've got, 4, I think, classes left, maybe 5, but one of those, if he's still up to it, I'm going to give my time to Robbie to let him finish up the material that he started at the beginning of the class whenever I was in Arizona. So we don't have a whole lot of time left to cover the material that I wanted, but I think we've got enough time to get everything in there. We're going to shift today and start looking at an issue that really is at the center of the debate on evolution versus creation. And I will introduce that topic right after we have an opening prayer.
Let's pray. Our Father in heaven, thank you for this day you've given us and the sunshine and the warmth that we enjoy this time of year. We're so blessed to know your creation is for us and that we can enjoy the things that you've created. We are so thankful for Kyle and his class and letting us learn more about the world's view on creation. But we know that you are the great creator. You created all things, and we just pray that we can talk to our neighbors, friends, those who are led astray into to these false doctrines. We just pray that we can combat that and preach the truth. We're thankful for our kiddos that are at camp. We just pray that you're with them this rest this week, and we're just so glorified in the Harris family and their daughter being baptized. We just glorify in that. Just be with us the rest of the service and be with us as we travel. This is our prayer in Christ's name.
Amen. All right, before I put the Bible verse up, we read that, let me pose a question to you. So you're having a conversation, you're having lunch with a good friend, maybe talking to your neighbor across the fence, and they finally come out with it. You know, I know you're a Christian, you believe the Bible. There is no evidence of a global flood. If you could just show me some evidence of that, I may believe it. Where are you going to go with that? What do you think you would do with a question like that, Aaron?
There are so many cultures that have a flood account. There's hundreds of different flood accounts course, details differ, but obviously, for so many cultures from so many different places, separated by language and time and whatnot, something catastrophic happened for them to have a story that they carry on generation by generation.
I think that's a great one, and specifically that point you made, separated by space and time. Now we're talking about cultures that are on opposite sides of the earth that existed thousands of years after one another. We're talking about people that are in our time frame. We're getting closer to AD, to contemporary era, and we have cultures that are still telling stories on the other side of the world about a act of divine judgment in which man was spared through a great flood. So that's a really good one to point to. Just the fact that we have these myths, these legends in every culture that have to be based off of something. Let's go. What else?
How do they explain fossil seashells in the Himalayan mountains?
Yeah, that's a really good one too. Is the fossil record details that there was a point in time in which places that should not have been underwater were underwater. There is the common belief that the whole earth was at one point covered in water. But I think being able to point to things such as you just mentioned, the Himalayas, places where, how is their life to be fossilized on top of? It's not just that we're saying the whole earth was underwater, it's that there was life that got trapped in sediment that is now on top of a very high mountain. It's very different than what you might sometimes hear someone say when they go, well, of course I believe the whole world was underwater at some point. You go back, several billion years. Water is supposedly the oldest element there is. Water predates the earth. And there might be a truth to that. Because the Bible tells us, in the beginning, Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the deep. But how did life wind up in that water and then wind up in sediment that was fossilized and placed on top of a very high mountain? It's a really good one as well. Any others?
You mentioned the fossils that can be found across strata, the wrong direction, vertically instead of horizontally.
Yes, the remains of fossilized trees and animals that are polystrates. They are many strata, many levels that they cover. Those are all very, very good. So, as I said, we're going to start to deal with what is the very core of the evolutionary discussion. I truly believe this to be when we say evolution, this is one of the very first things that pops into most people's minds. To kind of prepare ourselves for that, I will put the USB dongle back in the computer so it'll work. And then we'll have a clicker. All right. Jonathan, would you read Isaiah 43, verse 1 and verse 7 for us?
But now this says the Lord, your creator, O Jacob, and he who formed you, O Israel, do not fear, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by name. You are mine. Everyone who is called by my name, and whom I have created for my glory, whom I have formed, even whom I have made.
All right. What do we learn? What's just a few things that stand out to you about Isaiah 43, verses 1 through 7?
Section of, obviously God's our creator, and the idea that he has a very personal relationship with us, that, again, other verses will talk about how, he's known us before we existed.
Yeah, I think let's separate those for a minute. So we have creator, but also we have personal God. He says in here, do not fear, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by name, one. The idea of a relationship with our God. And I've said this before, it's cheesy, I know. The opening scenes from the TV series Chosen that displays a young, spoiler alert, unbeknownst to you at that time, Mary Magdalene, her father referring to a very similar verse, I've called you by name. I know your name. reminding her when she was scared. This moment where she comes to her father, she can't sleep, I'm scared, and this is what he whispers in her ear. Yahweh knows your name. And later in her life, when Jesus, again, artistic licensing, calls to her by name, even though she's going by a different name at the time, that verse is brought back to our minds that Yahweh knows your name. That's one of the things that stands out to me whenever I read this verse as well, is just fixating on that. We have a personal relationship with this God, or at least we can. He knows us. We belong to him. But the second aspect, and what I think more prevalent to our study this evening, is he is our creator. He who formed you. He who made you. That language is going to be used throughout the Bible, and it flies in the face of modern evolutionary thought that teaches that we were not made by a divine creator, but by cosmic coincidence in which microbe became mammal, became primate, became human. Let me put a quote up for you here. Raise your hand if you know who said this. I got one over here knows who said it. Anybody else? God creates dinosaurs. Let me read it, I'm sorry. God creates dinosaurs. God destroys dinosaurs. God creates man. Man destroys God. Man creates dinosaurs. Now, can you tell me the name of the doctor?
Dr. Ian Malcolm.
Dr. Ian Malcolm from Jurassic Park. And if you'll remember the scene, Dr. Dr. Ellie Sadler responds, dinosaurs eat man, woman inherits the earth. Tongue-in-cheek, a little bit of laughter to start the class off. But there is a lot more truth to what Jeff Goldblum's character says in this movie taking place in our life.
Women are going to inherit.
So this specifically, God creates man, man destroys God. This is the core of evolutionary teaching. That we are setting out to destroy, to put an end to the ridiculous mythology of a divine creator of the universe who has some sort of relationship and expectation over man. I used this quote the last class, but I wanted to bring it back up. It's from Richard Bozarth. He says, Christianity has fought, still fights, and will continue to fight science to the desperate end over evolution. Because evolution destroys utterly and finally the very reason Jesus' earthly life was supposedly made necessary. If you're going to give an answer, or if you're going to give a definition for that last clause that he says, the very reason Jesus' life was necessary, what's a word, just a single word you would plug in there? Jesus becoming human was necessary because, what would you put in there? So salvation, necessary for salvation, absolutely. That's fitting. What other word?
Reconciliation.
To be reconciled to God. Excellent. What's another word? We would be put Jesus' death on the cross was necessary because sin. Because of sin, we're getting even closer to the real cause. Because when it's all said and done, we will look to the good and we will look to the consequences, but the problem was not sin, and the problem was not that there was a salvation out there. The problem was us, man. Man is the reason Jesus' earthly life was necessary. And if I can recreate man in my image, I can get rid of this whole thing about Jesus. I don't need that. And that's exactly what Richard Bozarth is pointing out. And that's exactly the reason why classes like this are necessary. And that's why when people say, does it really matter if I believe in evolution? Are we talking about a salvation issue? No, I don't think we are often. But it can be. But when you ask that question, though, if you're saying, is it a salvation issue? It's asking one question. If you're asking, does it really matter? I think emphatically, yes. Yes, it does matter. Because evolution is an attack on our God. And so we need to know as much about it as we can. And even more than that, we need to know as much about the truth as we can. And so that we can be prepared to fight. And again, we don't fight like the world fights. We don't fight like Mr. Bozarth fights. But fight we must for the truth of what God has done. So, having said that, we're going to look a little bit at what the world says about the origins of man. Again, when I said, when you think evolution, it's one of the first things you think of. This image right here is probably it. Miss Carol, I'm sure you have seen this image before. When you think back to school, you have a monkey on one side that's walking, dragging its knuckles. And on the other side, you have a man and all the steps in between getting us from monkey to man. The idea that man is not a created being, but is a highly evolved primate. Now, you may get, I'm painting with a very broad brush. You'll get those who will say, no, he's not a primate. He's different. He's a completely different lineage, but there is a convergence at some point where they were once the same thing. But man is a subset that became a new creature, a new kind, if you to borrow biblical language. Man became a new kind, and these other kinds, they just continue to devolve or just turn into what our modern day monkeys are today. Man is different. I know I'm painting with a broad brush, but what you will oftentimes find is early man was an ape-like creature that dwelled in a cave. You'll also find, interestingly, a lot of people who believe that at some point these cave-dwelling ape-like creatures cohabitated with more modern, not modern man, but more modern, closer to modern man creatures. We're not going to get into it today, but we'll talk about Neanderthals. And the idea that Neanderthal is a subspecies in our lineage as we're going back. He's an ancestor of ours, but he's not modern man. But he did live with modern man. They cohabitated. So, what that tells us, and why we bring that up, why is that so important, is there is an accepted belief in the evolutionary world that these species ran together at one point. That it wasn't just this one species, and we kind of think about it like this, okay, we had these monkeys for a while, and then all of a sudden they died out and were replaced with one, a monkey that walked more upright, and then that species kind of died out and was replaced with a species that was able to begin learning how to use tools, maybe rudimentary tools, and then that species died out and built up a species that was able to take those tools and with innovation create technology and therefore culture, society, civilization, and we're into modern man. That's not actually how a lot of the evolutionary world sees it. They would have run together for periods of time. And I think that is important for us to understand as we seek to reveal truth and as we seek to try to wrestle through these issues with those that might believe this way. All this supposedly happened roughly 10 to 6 million years ago. So as we go backwards, 6 to 10 million years backwards in the timeline, we're not getting to anything that we would consider remotely connected to the Homo sapien. Homo sapien is us. We're not getting anything to that level of evolutionary change until roughly about 2 to 4 million years ago. But all of these changes begin 10 million. Does that bring up a problem right away for anybody? We're talking about changes that occurred before the earth was made. It's going to be an issue. We'll think of some other problems that come up with this as we see the rest of it. This is a prevalent teaching. Have you all, science side of the classroom, have you all seen anything like this in the textbooks? It is in every textbook. What'll be interesting to discover through this class, I hope, is that how few evolutionary teachers actually like this drawing. And yet, it is still used to teach children. It is going to be shown in children's programming. It is going to be referenced in other graphical ways to teach our kids that there is a much more reliable alternative to creationism, and that is the evolution of man. Bill Nye, the Science Guy, and Disney have done a lot of work to try and show our children that this is much more acceptable, much more accurate and truthful than what we read in the Bible. And so, 10 to 6 million years, 2 to 4 million years ago, getting closer to Homo sapien, but span of about 10 million years, we have creatures that look like this to creatures that look like this. What do you expect we should demand for this to be true?
The transitional fossils.
Transitional fossils. There must be. In 10 million years, there must be abundant evidence. In fact, not only that, for how often this is cited. As I said, textbooks and science classes and our media, and just you talk to anybody that has graduated high school and before and say, tell me a little bit about evolution. One of the first things they're going to say is, we used to swing in trees by our tails. And we have evolved to walk upright. At some point, we came out of the trees and we started living in caves. This is so prevalent that for you to believe something different than that, there must be something wrong with you. If it's that prevalent of teaching, you would think there would be an abundance of transitional fossil records, an abundance of, not even that, just evidence in general. Maybe we don't have transitional evidence or fossils, but we have some form of evidence that makes this so prevalent.
Why are we not still evolving?
Why are we not still evolving? So the answer to that is oftentimes given is, one, we're not still evolving because you can't see evolutionary change. It occurs over such a long period of time that you would have to be able to monitor 1 million years to be able to see it.
They'll say it happens in populations, not individuals.
Or exactly.
Yeah, that's why it takes such a long period of time.
Right. So a small change here and a small change there, and then some interbreeding in those changes, and these mutations all add up to something that you almost don't see happen. Or, as we talked about with some of the other classes, it'll just happen. And it just hasn't happened yet because there's great periods of rest. The other thing that often is brought up is, why aren't there more monkeys evolving into a more human life? Why did that stop? And the answer that is often given to that, not to belittle it in any way, is that these species just stopped evolving. They started devolving. Monkeys don't swing as much as we might like to think by their tails, but we'll take a fossil record and go, you see all these bones here, this teaches that monkey used to swing by its tail, and now they've evolved to be able to do that. They can still hold themselves up by their tail. Tails aren't as supportive as they used to be. So there's actually thought that some of these creatures stopped evolving and started devolving. But none of those are going to take us away from this had to have happened. So maybe we have to adjust time scales, which has occurred. In fact, there was a very popular book, I'm going to reference the author in a little bit, that was written around 2005 that put a lot of this occurring at 7 million years. Now, most of the evolutionary teaching is no, that's too recent. This had to have taken place further back than that. Even though we still say 10 to 6 million, we lean closer to 10 million years ago. So we just move things around to make it fit. So there must be an abundance of evidence. I mentioned an author. I'm going to go ahead and quote him now. I didn't know I was coming up so quick. This is Palmer, Richard Palmer, I think was his name. But he's the one that wrote the book about 7 million years ago and the evolution of man. And in it, he does address some very common fallacies, even though he is a big believer in this form of evolution. But he acknowledges as well, we probably know more about the extinct trilobite than we do about the evolution of man. And what's interesting about his creature that he has chosen is the trilobite is, if you'll recall, that fossil, the marine fossil that I've shown, it's a vertebrate, and it's got exceptional eyes. Eyes of a trilobite are incredibly complex, and yet there is no sign of evolutionary change in them throughout the span of which we find trilobites. And he's saying we know more about these trilobites that show no evolutionary change than we do about humans. That should probably tell us something. But it points out a very worrying, troublesome fact. Maybe all of this dogma about man evolving from a primate doesn't have as much evidence as the world has been led on to believe. So let's consider some of the evidences that we see. One of the first things that we need to recognize is that this idea of evolutionary change from primate to man is highly contested. It is not just everybody agrees on this. They disagree on so many different things. Not just that it, maybe we'll say, okay, we believe that must have happened, but getting back to something Aaron said a minute ago, evolution happens in populations, not in individuals. Well, which population started this? There is a huge argument over whether or not this happened maybe in relationship to a lot of other life in somewhere around Africa, that we had this change begin to take place on the African continent, or did this happen simultaneously around the world and start having these creatures that were experiencing mutations that eventually would lead to modern man popping up all over the earth? Huge argument over that. We're not in any form of agreement. There's so many different camps as to whether that happened. I've got a picture of Charles Darwin up here. Darwin is quoted, he said in one of, I think it's The Descent of Man, it says, the origin of man is a distinct species by descent from some lower form. Distinct species by descent. So what Charles Darwin is saying, man is very distinct from another form of creature, and he has descended along that. We can trace that lineage back. Henry Gee, who is, we've referenced him a couple times. He is a writer for, I've got it wrote down here. I'll look it up in a second. He says we cannot say anything definite about the ancestry of descent. Very, very opposing, contradictory statements that are made by what we would consider experts in these fields. Charles Darwin, The Descent of Man, also admitted that even though man is a distinct species, there is no fossil evidence that has ever been found to support his idea that we have descended from another lower form. Charles Darwin, who probably is, we would consider him the father. A lot of people are going to say we don't believe in Darwinism. We're neo-Darwinists. We have taken what he started and we've added and grown and changed it to what is true today. And I'll just put it that way, and we'll let that rest. So that may be true, but Charles Darwin, who kind of kick-started this in popularity, was proven wrong by the very metric that he said is the only thing that can prove me wrong, the fossil record. And it is shown time and time again there'd be zero evidence of this. Henry Gee is the chief science writer for the journal Nature. They're not going to allow just anybody to write in this. A couple other things that Henry Guy has said. It's impossible when confronted with a fossil to be certain whether it's your ancestor or the ancestor of anything else, even another fossil. He says, we absolutely cannot take two fossils and go, oh, this one came from this one. We have no ability to do this. Henry Guy actually has some really fine quotes here. He has also said, we know that adaptive scenarios are justifications for particular arrangements of fossils. These rely for their justification on authority rather than on testable hypothesis. So it really just depends on who the person is that is making the statement. When somebody very noteworthy says, this is the father of this, then that is true, as opposed to being able to test that and find that out. Again, Henry Guy believes in the image that we had up a second ago. He believes in the evolution of man. He has also stated that no fossil is buried with its birth certificate. I think we've referenced this one before. That and the scarcity of fossils means that it is effectively impossible to link fossils into chains of cause and effect in any valid way. In reality, the physical record of human evolution is more modest. Each fossil represents an isolated point with no knowledgeable connection to another given fossil. They all float around in an overwhelming sea of gaps, as if the chain of ancestry and descent were a real object for our contemplation, and not what it really is, a completely human invention. He also goes on to mention that it was created after the fact. You know, that it's not that we had a hypothesis and then we went and tested it. Instead, we got all this stuff and then we made a hypothesis about it, and then we said, okay, this is our theory. He also goes on to say, to take a line of fossils and claim they represent a lineage is not a scientific hypothesis that can be tested, but an assertion that carries the same validity as a bedtime story. Amusing, perhaps even instructive, but not scientific. Henry Guy had some really impressive things to say about the very process that he believes in and that he writes about. And we've referenced some other doctors who have, and paleontologists and microbiologists and other people that had a similar issue is, look, we do want the truth. And the truth is, we've been fabricating a lot. We've been forcing things into how we want them. We kind of create the keyhole and the key, and we put it together. Aaron.
Well, to me, at least from the without knowing anything else about the man other than the quotes that you cited, he sounded like an honest scientist.
Right.
And an honest scientist is going to question. Unfortunately, there's a lot of bad science out there where evidence is sought to fit the hypothesis rather than testing and trying to disprove the hypothesis.
Absolutely.
And that is horrible science. And there have been a lot of dead ends over the decades that have been carried along because of that.
Yeah.
But to give the man credit, he sounds like he's at least an honest scientist and willing to question.
And I believe that to be a fair assumption of the quotes that we have. That's all I have of the guy. And there's been others like that it appears that science as a whole, there are those who want to remain faithful to it. And I mean that in the greatest deal of respect, not as the religion that they've propped up, but the way in which they examine the world around them. And when you do that, you're inevitably drawn to statements like Henry made. I forget the other doctor we looked so much at a couple classes ago, which say, look, we need to do this the right way. We can't just go, okay, this is what we think fits, so we're going to stick it in there. We need to look at this correctly and accurately. And again, he's not alone. There are others as well. These two men here, Doctors Lowenstein and Zillman, They are writing an article called The Invisible Ape. They're going to corroborate a lot of Gee's sentiments. They'll say the anatomy and the fossil record cannot be relied upon for evolutionary lineages, and yet paleontologists persist in doing just this. And this last one here, by Dr. Zillman, I thought was or not Zillman, by Dr. Shreve, I thought was so good. Everybody knows fossils are fickle. Bones will sing any song you want to hear. Again, this is I have him down as a doctor. Some of the material that I was reading from called him a doctor. I couldn't actually find evidence. I'm sure that he is. I just couldn't find any evidence of it. His name is James Shreve, and he is a science writer. And he's wrote many books on the issue of things revolving around human origins. He brings up a very interesting point that, Aaron, you kind of hit on as well. I think it is very important for us ourselves to reflect upon as we reach kind of this point in the class. Bones will sing any song you want to hear is a very subjective statement. What it is literally saying is the fossil will tell you what you want to know from it, what you want it to say. It's your puppet, and you can put words into it. That is 100% true for you and me and our use of Scripture to show our belief system in creation and in God. We must never be guilty of turning the Bible into our puppet to say what we want to say. Not only does that not further us, it's not going to help us be able to show other people the truth. The ones that do believe that are really only believing you. They're believing what you tell them because you're the one that has become the source of authority in the issue. And whenever that is inevitably proven false, because you're not the holder of all truth, God alone is that. So when that is proven false, what happens to those people? Their faith crumbles because it was built on bedrock. Or it was not built on bedrock. It was built on a shifting sand. We need to be building our beliefs and our examining evidences based upon the bedrock of truth. And that is what all of these men are pointing out. They're saying the exact same thing from the fossil world, from the paleontology world, looking at not just the applied sciences and the things that they don't see and the things that they're doing, but also the theoretical sciences. We have to stop basing this off of what we want and start basing it off of what we can know as a fact. And again, that's leading them to a completely different direction than it's leading me. And no doubt the cause of our schism is our worldview. That I hold the Word of God as an invariable truth. It does not change. It is the source of all truth. And they do not. But at the very least, I can appreciate a mind that says we want to examine things for what they are and not what we have long held them to be. We need to try to have that same sort of attitude as well. Any other thoughts here?
Well, you mentioned paleontology, and I've followed dinosaurs from a young age and watched all these various dinosaur documentaries and those kind of things. And I think you've mentioned it before, but just the idea that a lot of times we have incomplete specimens, and yet we'll construct a whole skeleton from that. I've seen various instances where they find, a shoulder bone, and that's all they found. But it's similar to this one over here, and this one's bigger, so this must be a separate species that's so much larger. Fairly recent, I'd say fairly recent, it's probably 10 or 15 years ago by this point. But for a while, there was two distinct ceratopsian species of dinosaurs, Triceratops and Torosaurus. And they've since decided that Torosaurus is not a separate species, but like possibly a juvenile Triceratops.
Yeah.
How many times has that happened?
Right.
Where we have so many different species of dinosaur, and yet, they're actually the same.
Right.
Well, now they decided Tyrannosaurus rex is actually possibly different specimens. It just goes back and forth, and you do get that impression that things are just kind of being, made up, and like you said, they just draw whatever conclusions they want to come to based on what they find, especially the incomplete specimens like that.
Yeah. We'll talk more about those specifically with human origin, because there's some really good evidence and examples of that very thing happening within studying our human descent as well. Aaron?
Well, I was just about to touch on that. There have been fragments of skulls that have been used to reconstruct proto-humans, the whole evolutionary chain from ape to man.
And what's actually there.
Yeah. As Mr. Brinson pointed out, could very possibly have been a juvenile human. We assume that it was a 3 foot tall humanoid ancestor rather than someone's child that had passed away.
Holly is supposed to be finding pictures that I think we have of some of those fossil remains when we visited the Museum of Natural History. So I'm really hoping that she finds those and so I can show them to you. But I do have some pictures of some of those very things that we'll look at on Sunday. And I think that they tell, like you said here, they sing whatever song you want, but they tell a story, and sometimes that story is not so forthright. As we get into that, I think we'll see more.
Some people want to change the lyrics of the song.
Just a little bit, yeah. They're not just changing the tune, they're changing the whole thing. A few other quotes before we kind of wrap things up. This is Dr. Ian Tattersall. If you'll recall, he is the curator of the American Museum of Natural History. He said, in paleoanthropology, the patterns we receive are as likely to result from our unconscious mindsets as from the evidence itself. Dr. Jeffrey Clark saying that paleoanthropology has the form but not the substance of science. Now what they're talking about, anthropology is the study of history. Paleoanthropology is the study of the history of man, the fossil record of man, the origins of man, where we came from. And what they're pointing out is the ability for this form of science. And again, I think that there is a way that this is a scientific area of study, but it has to be done so in a truly scientific process, as opposed to we want to prove our hypothesis that we've already concluded our fact as true. And so that's what Tattersall is pointing out, that oftentimes, even unconsciously, even though we don't mean to, we've already made it up in our mind. Man evolved from these creatures to become what it is today. And that's why when we see animals broken up, primates and Homo sapiens are oftentimes, almost always put within the same category because we came from them. And so even if it's unconscious, we're allowing that mindset to determine how we view the evidence. And that's the very reason why Clark says that this is not it looks like a form of science, but it doesn't have the substance of science because it's not following that correct way. Dr. Bernard Wood, speaking about that image again, the ape going to the human, there is a popular image of human evolution that you'll find all over the place. On the left of the picture, there's an ape. On the right, a man. Between the two is a succession of figures that become ever more like humans. Our progress from ape to human looks so smooth, so tidy. It's such a beguiling image that even the experts are loath to let it go. But it is an illusion. Over and over again, what these men are saying is, this is not as proven as you think it is. And they're not saying it to just random people. They're saying it to the experts of their field. This is not as solid a ground as you think. And the problem is, people will grow up and think everybody believes this is true. This has to be true because there must be so much evidence. The experts who are very honest would tell you, no, there's not. We believe it's true, but there's not as much evidence as you think.
That's where it goes from honest information to propaganda.
Yes. Yeah. So here's how it typically goes. You're dealing with someone who believes in this range. So you have the story that at some point in our distant past, we were a creature much like the apes that moved from tree to tree. At some point we came down and we inhabited caves. We started living on the ground. We began to walk upright and stop dragging our knuckles. We developed the ability to create technology and then civilization, and finally came to man. And you say, okay, that's the story. I'm not sure I believe that story. And they say, well, then look at the evidence. Here's the evidence for it. And what I have here, there's this chart that's got all of these different forms of creature on its way to Homo sapiens. And some of these we're going to get into a little bit. Homo ergaster and Homo erectus, Homo neanderthalensis, the Neanderthals. We're going to look at some of those. You say, look at all of the evidence we have. And I say, how do you know that evidence shows us that? Because we have this really good story. It's circular reasoning. It is heads I win, tails you lose. And you will be met with that again and again. We're going to get into some of the fossil record and the evidence on Sunday. I really look forward to it. But thank you all so much for your comments.